Welcome to Great Decisions, Reston Library's roundtable discussion of timely foreign policy issues. Our virtual offering of this exciting program will follow the Library Code of Conduct, where we respect customers to respect the moderator, guest speaker, and one another. We will start off with our moderator, who's Mike Carpenter, who will give a brief introduction, and questions may be posted to the chat feature in Zoom. All questions will be answered at the end of the event. So do you want to continue, Mike?
Yes, well, thank you very much, David. And thank you again to the library, you and all the staff there for making this possible. We all deeply appreciate it. And to all you great deciders out there, welcome to another year of great decisions. We're getting off to a good start for 2021. We already have about 4 or 5 of our speakers lined up for this year. So it promises to be a very interesting one for the various subjects that we're going to be discussing. Today's topic is the World Health Organization's response to COVID-19, which I thought was a very timely one given the swirl of events that's been going on around us since last January. And joining us for that is actually the author of the article that we read in preparation for today's session, Dr. Mara Pillinger from the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown University. And I'll be introducing her formally at the end of the film, which, David, if you're ready, you can roll now. David, if you can hear me, I'm not hearing anything on the film. Technical glitch. Normally, Mara, what we've been doing is sending the film out with the invitational email, and people have been watching it at home. But we thought that we'd try to show it first. What we normally do when we meet at the library is view the film together first, and then we go into the discussion. So we thought we'd try that again.
Sure.
In that sense, you're a guinea pig. So let's see if this works. It should. All the time I put in getting this thing out of the FPA the past few days, it better. We'll see. David, do you hear me? Good Lord.
They're on mute anyway, so.
They are? Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry for the delay. Oh boy. So what are you baking at the present time?
What am I baking?
Well, you said
Well,
yeah, it must be very occasional baking.
I was like, do you smell something? I'd love to, but I actually haven't had time recently. So it's been all pandemic all the time for me. So
all pandemic all the
and
time.
also I'm only one person, and like if I bake it, then I have to eat it all. Whereas if I'm going into work, I just bring it into the office and you're fine.
That's right.
It's probably been good that I've been staying away from that.
My wife and I baked a couple of shoe fly pies the other week.
Oh, nice.
Do you hear it?
We don't hear the film, nor do we see it at the present time, David. Yeah, those are the Pennsylvania Dutch specialty. I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And have you ever had shoe fly pie?
I have. I went to school in Philly, so we used to go to Reading.
Oh, of course. University of Pennsylvania. Absolutely. Okay. Well, you're familiar with Philadelphia
Happy
pepper
memories.
pot and all those other good things too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Memories. I don't know, maybe we get started talking, and then if the video works, we can break it
Yeah.
up.
Well, if David can hear me. David? David? Oh, Lord.
Mike, I appreciate all of your efforts.
David,
Yes, I don't quite see it. It was up earlier. I brought up. the
it was
screen.
up, but it was fine. It was running, but there was no sound.
Okay. I can continue working on it.
Well, if it's going to take much longer, why don't we just
Okay.
introduce
Let's
Dr.
start the decision. I mean, the discussion.
Okay. Can you get this? My screen has gone blank. Okay, I see you now.
Okay.
Right. Maybe you can play around with this and we can watch it at the tail end.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're honored today to have with us Dr. Mara Pillinger. She is an associate at Georgetown University's O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, working on global health policy. She holds a PhD in international relations from George Washington University, a master's in public health from Emory University, a master's of science in global governance and diplomacy from Oxford University, and her bachelor's degree is from the University of Pennsylvania. Her past research focuses on the political, organizational, and power dynamics at the World Health Organization and its global health partnerships. She is expert in the causes and consequences of repeated rounds of organizational and government reform and multi-sectoral partnerships. Her work has been published in Perspectives on Politics, Global Health Governance, The Washington Post, among other publications. Prior to completing her dissertation, Dr. Pillinger worked in various public health positions and undertook research at different institutions, including the Global Health Center Graduate Institute in Geneva. On a more personal note, Mara informs me she's a dog person, a sci-fi fantasy reader, an occasional baker, a pro cycling and baseball fan, and an inveterate New Yorker, which includes rooting for those damn Yankees. Dr. Pillinger, we extend to you a very warm welcome, and we thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm sorry for the technical glitch on the film. Hopefully we'll get to that.
I think I may be able to get it started.
You do?
If you like to try, yes.
We'll give you one more shot, David.
Okay. Let
Go
me
for
try
it.
this.
For us to get through this is to
That's
act
good.
together.
In the
That's
spring
good.
of
Keep it going.
2020, as a microscopic but deadly virus brought the world to a grinding halt, the President of the United States fixed his ire on an unlikely target.
We will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization and redirecting those funds to other worldwide and deserving urgent global public health needs.
The organization, once lauded for ridding the world of smallpox and bringing polio to the brink of eradication, has become a political flashpoint. Great Decisions investigates the global response to COVID-19, explores how geopolitical rivalries are spilling over into the realm of public health, and asks how the international community can prepare for the next pandemic. The World Health Organization. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
In the last week of May 2020, as an anxious spring rolled into a tragic summer, the 100,000th American died from COVID-19. And Donald Trump stepped into the Rose Garden to prosecute his case against the People's Republic of China.
Chinese officials ignored their reporting obligations to the World Health Organization and pressured the World Health Organization to mislead the world when the virus was first discovered by Chinese authorities.
At issue were the early weeks of the outbreak. American officials alleged that China was too slow to warn the rest of the world about the dangers of the new virus.
Certainly probably November and December of 2019, there was likely an outbreak happening in Wuhan that China hid from WHO and really only let WHO know on December 31st, 2019. And much of January, as WHO tried to get more information, China was hiding that information and just not being as forthcoming as it should have been.
It wasn't a shortage of proper rules and regulations that allowed China to obstruct the World Health Organization investigation for too long. It was a problem of China, first and foremost, being obstructionist, not being transparent, being more concerned about its reputation than about averting a global pandemic.
We now have a name for the disease, and it is COVID-19.
It's quite clear that China was relying on WHO to delay the response to the COVID-19 and also to understate the severity of COVID-19 in the early stage. And I think Beijing has made it very clear that they don't care who's responsible as long as China is not held responsible.
As COVID-19 exploded into a worldwide pandemic, some experts worried that the international response was leaderless and uncoordinated.
It requires coordination at every level, globally, nationally, and locally. And we're seeing a real patchwork of responses that, frankly, is undermining our ability to beat this virus.
There is not a clear global leader in the fight against COVID. In some ways, WHO is the closest that we have, and I think they're pretty valiantly trying to play that role, but they're doing it with limited capacity and very limited authority, and at the mercy of member states' willingness to cooperate.
With tensions mounting between the US and China, President Trump announced that the US, traditionally the largest contributor to the World Health Organization, would stop funding that institution.
Leaving the World Health Organization at the height of the most devastating pandemic in more than a century is the height of lunacy. It impedes the US ability to learn from other countries. It creates open season for China to step in and drive the World Health Organization in the direction that China thinks is in its interest. It's a humanitarian blow to vulnerable communities all around the world, which in turn is a blow to US leadership and US influence.
That WHO was deliberately delaying the announcement of the severity, or delaying or artificially underestimating or understating the severity of COVID-19, at least in the early stage of the pandemic. As late as February 4th, the Secretary General of the WHO was still saying that there's no need for a country to overreact to COVID-19.
Just because something is called the World Health Organization doesn't mean it's an unmitigated good that you can't criticize. I've had experience with the World Health Organization since my days in the Reagan presidency, and it's not the lean, mean, disease-fighting machine it was right after it was created in its early years where it had enormous success.
Mass infection and epidemics are a threat to every city, to every nation. Scientific and medical work on a local scale are no longer enough.
When delegates from around the world convened in San Francisco in the waning days of World War II to outline a framework for global governance, they made certain that health would be part of the mandate for the new United Nations. They recognized that the fight against infectious disease depended on global coordination.
They had experienced the health consequences of the Second World War, of course, and they were very clear that one would only have economic development in the world if one also had a healthy population.
There were epidemics of tuberculosis and other epidemic diseases, and there was risks of dysentery and other, risks to health that people were moving around populations and so on after the war. So it was agreed that WHO would be formed and that there would be international cooperation.
What it tries to do is to provide technical guidance to countries around the world on how to respond to health challenges. It tries to set standards with the input of countries around the world for the response to global health crises, to medical issues, to public health issues.
Even during the most antagonistic years of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union managed to cooperate on matters of health.
The eradication of smallpox originated with a resolution proposed by the Soviets. It is the only human disease ever to have been eradicated. But think about that. In the 20th century alone, 300 million people are thought to have died of smallpox.
But after a few decades, many observers had grown discontent with the WHO and its broadening mission.
If you take a look at what the organization prides itself on, which is the near eradication of polio, the eradication of smallpox, combating other infectious diseases, these were the focus of the organization in its early days. And the organization lost its focus in the 1970s and 1980s and started focusing on a number of different issues that arguably should be the focus of domestic health agencies and domestic governments.
I remember back in the Bush 41 administration, the early Clinton administration, the global response to HIV/AIDS was taken out of the WHO and made a separate UN component because people simply felt the World Health Organization wasn't up to the challenge. And I think since then, the bureaucracy hasn't gotten any better.
Like many other international organizations, the WHO has no mechanism to enforce its authority and relies on achieving consensus from its member states.
No one gave WHO the authority to enforce compliance. No country wanted them to have that degree of authority, including the United States, so they simply don't have it.
Member states, when things like health security crop up, get incredibly defensive, nationalistic, and the WHO has to navigate. It doesn't have the authority to tell other governments what to do.
It has to also play a political role because WHO can be invited into a country, but they can also be kicked out of a country. We saw this recently with COVID-19, where Burundi expelled 3 WHO high officers. And so WHO has to kind of walk this line.
We have the authority that the member states give us. WHO is what its 194 member states want it to be. And really, it is not a question of exercising authority or compelling member states to do something. It is about persuasion. And that really is how the multilateral system works.
In 2002, doctors in southern China began documenting an alarming outbreak. Patients infected with a new type of virus were developing a condition known as severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. Faced with the threat of this contagious new virus, the WHO sprang into action.
It had a very strong director general, a woman named Gro Brundtland, who was a former prime minister. And when China at that point was not being very forthcoming with data about what was happening with SARS, she took a pretty strong stance and chastised China and really pushed China to be much more forthcoming about the data that was coming out of the SARS outbreak.
WHO had criticized governments in the past for not being transparent about health emergencies going on within their borders or infectious disease outbreaks, and had been heavily criticized for that, and Brundtland went ahead and did it anyway.
But in the aftermath of the SARS outbreak, the WHO's member states grew concerned about how much authority the organization had appropriated.
The overall reaction from member states was kind of, great job, don't do it again. The naming and shaming function, calling for trade and travel restrictions were all things that made governments uncomfortable more broadly as sort of an infringement on sovereignty.
What came out of SARS was something called the International Health Regulations, sort of a set of rules of the road that WHO and all the countries were supposed to follow in the context of cross-national disease outbreaks. And part of IHR was the idea that WHO should not chastise and really stand up to member states.
As I have said before, and I can repeat, it took much too long time before we got that kind of collaboration to get the data and to know what advice to give and how to help them contain the outbreak. It took much too long time.
There are no IAEA-like authorities within the International Health Regulation, and that was not an oversight. I was on the negotiating side for the United States, and it was a very deliberate decision.
For most of the WHO's existence, it has relied heavily on the U.S. to finance its operations.
Traditionally, the United States has been the largest provider of funding to the World Health Organization, both in terms of assessed funding, which is sort of the dues to the organization, but also in terms of voluntary contributions to the organization as well.
When WHO started, it was mainly these assessed contributions by member states. Right now, we actually have a balance that the assessed contribution by member states are only 20% of the WHO's budget.
About 80% of its funding comes in the form of voluntary contributions from donors, mostly member state governments like the US, but also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a huge one. And that money is largely earmarked, meaning that the donors decide what they want it to be used for.
Concerns about the WHO's independence have grown now that the voluntary contributions controlled by member states make up the vast majority of the organization's budget.
This changed over time because wealthy countries pushed to reduce the mandatory contributions and replace them in some way with voluntary contributions. And the implications for the organization are enormous.
That opens up the WHO to the highest bidder in terms of who provides funding is going to have more political influence. And that was one of the major issues thus far in the COVID response, is that they're really focused on making sure that they don't upset anybody.
Within the past decade, several international commissions put forth proposals to modernize the WHO. Not one of those reforms was put into action.
What is the core of the proposed reform? For member states to provide greater powers of independence for the WHO Director General and his or her Secretariat to collect data, and secondly, to issue warnings, and when data is not forthcoming, to blow the whistle internationally on why that data is not forthcoming. At present, all these reform proposals that have been put on the WHO table have been allowed to drift away by WHO member states.
Now that the COVID-19 pandemic has awakened the world to the potential danger of emerging disease, experts debate whether the WHO needs broader authority to enforce its mandate.
No, the World Health Organization doesn't have any kind of enforcement authority. It really shouldn't have enforcement authority. This is a situation where member states need to come together to work together to pledge to honor certain standards and certain practices.
It's not ultimately just about putting some authority on paper to say the Director General can do X, Y, or Z. It's also about thinking through the steps of why would a member state then actually choose to comply with that.
So if WHO gets the authority to be able to go into China against China's will, then it needs to have the authority to go into the United States against America's will. My sense is this is a nice idea, but countries are not ultimately going to agree to it. Certainly not the United States, not China.
Some critics assert that the WHO is no longer the best organization to coordinate global health.
This was a different virus. This was a house on fire. And WHO is simply not, at this time, geared to be a fireman.
It was created in 1948. There were 48 member states. Now, fast forward today, we have 194 member states. Many of those states are low and middle income countries, and they require very different things from WHO.
We still need the WHO no matter what. We need that official body. But the question is, do we need some complementary entity that would be able to do this inspection or audit kind of approach?
Or will we end up in a situation where we have nothing because the states weren't really able to cooperate with a China that's challenging not only the United States, but the whole liberal world order and its principles?
As the WHO's assessed contributions from nation states have tailed off, some private organizations have stepped in to fill the void.
Its funding is incredibly precarious. It is tremendously underfunded. It has this tremendous mandate to cover sort of all health issues all over the world, and it does that on a budget that's about the budget of a large hospital system in the US.
About 10% of the overall WHO budget is now also financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, again, mainly in focus programs.
With a nationalist tide sweeping the globe, politicians are proving increasingly unwilling to tolerate interference from multilateral institutions. The WHO must figure out how to operate effectively in a difficult geopolitical environment.
There is a rise of nationalism in very many places, and it does affect the WHO indirectly by making some countries less likely to contribute or be supportive of multilateral initiatives.
To what extent the great powers are willing to manipulate international organizations to serve their own cause, to implement their own agenda, that's really the problem. And that's an independent problem from nationalism.
What you have now is nationalist rhetoric, but internationalist challenges. It's not a coincidence that nationalist leaders, by and large, have fared the least well in tackling the COVID pandemic, because they're trying to bring a set of tools to bear that don't take account of our connectedness.
The first step, some experts say, is to evaluate whether China's influence within the WHO has grown too strong.
The World Health Organization was concerned that if it was very critical of China and its lack of cooperation, lack of transparency, that could restrict further the World Health Organization's access to Wuhan and access and cooperation that the Chinese government was getting. So it was over the top in terms of its praise for China.
China has been very skillful at entering and penetrating a lot of international institutions that were really created as part of the liberal Western world order and based on liberal values such as transparency and openness, etc. But China, when it enters these institutions, although it subscribes to them, it signs all the agreements, it doesn't respect the rules.
One of the reasons WHO was subservient to China in the coronavirus pandemic was that a Chinese national had been Director General for 10 years before the current DG. And I think that's a mistake.
Every member state in every international organization tries to get its way. To the degree that China has influence that it should not have within the WHO, that's a failure of the Trump administration and of diplomacy and of other countries to build coalitions to block China's efforts.
At a moment of rising tension between Beijing and Washington, the WHO has become a battleground.
COVID-19 has fallen smash in the middle of a geopolitical conflict between the United States and between China. For political reasons, the United States has held back and has not joined many of these attempts to create a truly global approach.
One of the big worries I had was that if one of the big countries does badly domestically, if COVID really hits them badly, then the big danger is they will then externalize that into geopolitics. And the Trump administration decided the WHO was a good way of critiquing and harming China.
The challenge currently facing American policymakers is to determine how the U.S. can play a leadership role in the field of health.
In a bipartisan way, most people have recognized that investments in developing health systems is an investment in U.S. national security. So I think it is a mistake to go looking for credit if your investments in global public health infrastructure are only about that. You are missing the point.
People don't talk about smallpox anymore because the United States led on this, provided the funding to do that. Polio is another one that we're close to eradicating, and so we know how to do this. It's going to take all of us working together.
Other countries work within the institutions to push back at China, whereas the United States chooses more and more to depart from these institutions, probably because China and the US are main opponents in the world order, and China is trying to push the United States down from being the dominant power in the world.
A lesson of COVID is, maybe the overarching lesson, is that there is no them. It is just us. We are all susceptible to the same microbes. Individually, we are no match for nature, but together we are. I cannot imagine, even now, the US actually leaving WHO. It is, to me, unthinkable.
Going forward, the most crucial question will be what lessons the international community can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic to make sure it responds more effectively to the next emerging disease. Back in 1948, the WHO's constitution boldly proclaimed that the achievement of any state in the promotion and protection of health is of value to all. But today, the stakes for the global community are even higher. In our interconnected world, the failure of any state is a danger to all.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs.
Well, very good. We're back after watching the film. I apologize to our audience for any choppiness that you might have seen in that film. We literally secured that this morning from the Foreign Policy Association. They've been delayed in getting both their publications and their films out this year due to the pandemic. And they said they hadn't done a final cut on the film, but I think we certainly got the gist of it. And one of the main gists, I should think, is the perceived difficulty that we're having with China vis-a-vis the COVID pandemic. And perhaps I can start the questions by posing this one to our guest, Dr. Pillinger. There's a WHO mission that is actually right now in China beginning to investigate the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. What do you rate their chances of success being? The fact that the trail has gone cold after a year, and also there is the distinct possibility of some Chinese obfuscation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the question, and there's kind of three pieces to it. One is that finding the origin of a virus under the best conditions is incredibly difficult. So the likelihood of success, particularly within the next year or so, without years and years of research into this, is pretty low to begin with. It's a high bar. The fact that they're coming in a year later, when it's unclear how much evidence that was gathered from the seafood market where we first heard that this started has been preserved, if any of it, when the trail has gone cold, makes that exponentially harder. And then there's a question of whether they're how forthcoming the Chinese government is going to be, how much access people are going to be allowed, how freely the people they speak to will speak, even if they're not under direct pressure not to. And we've already seen, actually, China most recently didn't allow 2 members of this team into the country because they had COVID antibodies, which is puzzling because having antibodies means that you've had the virus and have cleared it and are okay now and are not infectious. So it doesn't mean that it's not a positive COVID test where you are actively infectious. So why this was grounds to prevent those members from entering after they had already been approved, I'm not sure. As far as I've seen, they haven't released the names of the members, so you can't even make kind of guesses about what role geopolitics might have played there. So I think it's going to be a high hurdle for all of those reasons. And it's unfortunate because knowing where the virus comes from isn't really going to help us stop this pandemic, but it might help us stop the next one.
And the virus itself has not totally run its course in China, has it? I mean, they produced a vaccine now, but they're still having a problem in certain sectors of the society.
Yeah, recently we've seen, China, through very controversial means that we can discuss, ultimately did a very, very good job bringing the virus under control, and life has been pretty much normal there for a while now. And we're beginning to see cases spike again. I think with the winter and stuff like that, it's kind of to be expected. And they've once again instituted lockdown. So I think 20 million people in parts of the country are on lockdown of some variety. So no, maybe with the exception of New Zealand or places that are keeping really tight border restrictions in place and can do that, no place in the world has beaten the virus.
Our track record in the United States has not been particularly sterling in addressing this issue. Is there anything that we might have learned from the approach that China took? You said some of their approaches were controversial. I imagine some of them might not be readily accepted by our society, but is there anything we possibly could have learned and applied here?
Very, very much so controversial, and very much so would not have been accepted here. I hesitate to say that we should have learned from China's response, because the tone and tenor of that response and the human rights implications involved are things that I think really cut against the grain. But the techniques that they used, the quarantines, the restrictions, implemented in a more a manner sort of more consistent with our laws and norms, are at the time the only techniques that we have, still essential techniques. They're not without their downsides, but we don't have very many clubs in our bag. And so those basic global health strategies that China employ, they're not Chinese strategies. They are the playbook. They're the global playbook. And we need to use the tools that we do have. And once they acted with urgency. So it took them much, much too long to act. But when they did, they acted with a real sense of the gravity of what was happening. And they moved swiftly and decisively and with urgency, and using the capacity that the government had to bring this under control. And our government has not moved swiftly or with urgency. You're using the capacity that it has to bring this under control. So a little bit more more energy directed towards the problem is maybe something we could have taken also.
From your public health perspective, do you have confidence in the vaccine that China has developed?
So I have confidence in the vaccines in general. So China's developed a couple of different vaccines. It really, confidence in the vaccine should be determined by the efficacy data. So we've seen data come out for one of the vaccines that they developed from the UAE saying it was upwards of 80% effective. I would really like to see that analysis replicated by other regulatory authorities. The other vaccine that they've come up with, which is the one that has been under discussion in Brazil and stuff, the numbers there are a lot more sketchy. Let's say they came out with an estimate that was in like the high 70s, and then someone else came out and said, no, actually, if you kind of analyze the data appropriately, it's really in the low 50s, which is just barely meeting the bar for efficacy. So I think when the data is released and is available for experts to analyze and weigh in on and has been approved by regulatory authorities, then I would have confidence in the vaccine. We are not there yet. But I don't think there's anything, inherently, fishy about a Chinese-made vaccine.
What is the regulatory, the gold standard regulatory authority that would pass on something like that? Is there a worldwide entity, or is it by country?
The process of the overlapping layers of regulatory authority and how these vaccines get approved is a little bit complicated. I think the gold standard is still the US FDA, honestly. Certainly the European regulatory authorities are also equally capable. So WHO has a program called pre-qualification, where they go part of the way towards certifying that a drug is safe and using some of the same information that regulatory authorities play. But it's a way of sort of helping, the role that they play is to kind of help low and middle income countries that don't have their own regulatory authorities feel comfortable in certifying the vaccine. And those countries kind of use WHO's certification as a substitute for their own. Countries that have their own regulatory authorities generally don't do that. And WHO generally doesn't issue their stamp of approval unless it has also been approved by what they consider to be a reputable regulatory authority. So the US or the EU or the UK or something like that.
Speaking more broadly away from China, we do have the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines now that are in common use in our country. Do you see any others coming down the road quickly? Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, we were expecting the J&J data like in around now, and it seems like it'll be a little bit delayed. The AstraZeneca vaccine has been approved in other countries, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. In the US, we are still waiting on the results from the US trials of that vaccine. In part because I'm not sure how much you guys have heard, but the way that the trial was conducted, they kind of made a mistake and recovered from it and then changed some of the protocols. And so some people got a dose and a half and some people got 2 full doses, and they saw different efficacy in those groups, but there were also other differences, so hard to compare. So the FDA wants to wait for the US data, and we'll find out when. No word yet on when that's expected, but those are the other 2 vaccines that the US has significant amounts pre-ordered.
I've been pummeling you with questions. I'll take one, I'll do one more, and then I'd like to hear from our fellow great deciders out there if you have any questions. Prior to the session, Dr. Pillinger and I were speaking about the COVID pandemic, and I posed to her the question as to what is taking so long to produce vaccine in greater volume so that we're not holding up the whole vaccination process. I read earlier today, I think on CNN, there was a blurb that today Los Angeles is going to be opening the largest vaccine center in the United States. In fact, it's going to be Dodger Stadium. So you as a Yankees fan, I hope will appreciate that. But
get my vaccine anywhere I can.
Anywhere you can. But what is it that's taking so long to produce this en masse, to get out more of the medication to put in more people's arms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, part of it is just the magnitude of the problem is massive. We're trying to churn out millions and millions of doses, and there are issues with raw materials and the glass vials that are used and stuff like that. But I would argue, and people would disagree with me on this, I would argue that the major barrier at this point is intellectual property rights and restrictions. So if we could manufacture these vaccines, use generic manufacturing, allow other drug companies to use their manufacturing facilities, the whole world could be making a lot more vaccine than we are. Some of this scarcity is artificial. And it's because the pharmaceutical companies that hold the patents on the vaccines are keeping a tight rein on those. There are multiple mechanisms, like globally and in international law, that have been set up to facilitate this, to share the technology. And there are provisions in international law that allow countries to issue what's called a compulsory license, to sort of take that intellectual property on a temporary basis and allow other manufacturers to use it. And these set of flexibilities that allow that are called the TRIPS flexibilities. So governments have the authority to do that. Internationally, they're pushing at the World Trade Organization for a blanket waiver of use of these TRIPS flexibilities so that countries don't have to do it on a one-off basis, every country, every vaccine, which just makes the coordination a lot harder, and makes the sharing of vaccine across countries a lot harder. But you can also sort of pressure the companies into voluntary licensing agreements where they voluntarily allow other companies to access the IP needed to make the vaccine, and that's on a temporary basis, and they kind of take it back. But that's without using international law to do or domestic law to do it. So we have options to produce a lot more vaccines than we are, and unfortunately, right now, it seems that governments are sort of deferring to the intellectual property rights of countries ahead of, protecting the health of their populations.
Would you care to speculate on what the incoming Biden administration might do in this regard?
It's a hard call. I mean, I sincerely hope that they will think about using these. There's no doubt in my mind that this needs to happen, and it needs to happen both for the US population and for global access. And really important to know that the pandemic doesn't end anywhere until it ends everywhere. So the delays that we're seeing in vaccinating the global south are not just sort of morally unacceptable, but they also prolong the economic agony of the pandemic for everyone, and for all businesses. So, I would like to see change, but that said, the political influence of companies around intellectual property and the USTR's position on this is really hard and fast and ingrained and very difficult to change. And even though these flexibilities are really, one, already exist in law, and two, are really only limited to the pandemic, it's not kind of precedent setting in that you're creating a slippery slope, because thankfully pandemics don't come along all the time. I still am skeptical whether the Biden administration will take on and overcome, or the voices within the Biden administration that would advocate for this will be able to take on and overcome the entrenched special interests around preserving IP.
David, do we have any questions from our other members?
Okay, we have a few questions. This is from Mara. Assuming the U.S. remains a member of the WHO, what reforms or policy changes would you advocate with an eye on the next global pandemic or pandemics?
It's a really good question. And I kind of want to answer it two ways, because there are the policy changes that I would advocate and the policy changes that we have any hope of getting, and those are not the same thing. I think one big piece that has to happen, and it's looking likely that it will happen, hopefully, is unfreezing the assessed contributions. So the mandatory contributions that member states have to give to WHO, those amounts have been frozen since the early 1990s, and it really cripples the organization. And so if you want to have an organization that is competent and capable of doing things, you have to finance it to do them. And member states have kind of long resisted increasing those, but now they're starting to recognize that this has to happen, and there's been a lot of strong statements around that. So for that, I'm optimistic. Another issue is the sort of political independence that WHO has. And this is the kind of situation where, what member states say they want or what they think they want when you're talking about WHO's actions vis-a-vis another country is really different than what they want when you're talking about WHO's actions vis-a-vis themselves. Every country wants a WHO, every country except China wants a WHO that's strong enough to push back on China when it's being uncooperative or hiding data. And no country wants a WHO that's strong enough to push on them. And you can't have it both ways. And if we want to have an organization that is able to get access to the information that it needs, regardless of government cooperation, that is able to kind of issue warnings free of the constraints, the worries about stepping on member states' toes, we need to give it political independence. And it's funny and ironic and sad because in a lot of the reform discussions that we've seen so far, governments are saying, yes, we need an independent WHO. We need an authoritative WHO. Oh, and by the way, we need more member state oversight of WHO's response to these crises. We need the executive board to be even more involved than it already is, which, to be fair, isn't very involved, in overseeing WHO's decision-making and response in crisis moments. And more member state oversight and political independence don't work together. You don't get both, right? So pick one, and the one that you pick will determine in large part how effective WHO is able to be in the next pandemic. And I suspect it will come down on the side of member state oversight, which means that WHO is going to continue to have to, play it very carefully and very diplomatically when engaging with governments. And it's worth pointing out that it's not just China, right? Like one of the big reasons that WHO delayed for so long in declaring a public health emergency for Ebola in West Africa was because the governments of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone were pushing on it not to. So China is a rising power and it gives a lot of money, but not nearly as much as the US does. And it has influence, but not nearly as much as the US does. So WHO is deferential to China, but Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone don't. And WHO is deferential to them anyway. WHO is just deferential to its member states because that's what member states tell it to do. So they have to give it different orders if they want a different outcome.
Okay, we have another question. Regarding the third world, let's say, for example, Africa, will China send its vaccine there in order to gain influence?
Yep. Next question.
That was easy.
Right. I mean, yes, and it will be effective.
Question?
I mean, if it doesn't work, it's not going to be as effective. So that's a whole different story. But
okay. What is the U.S. current status with respect to the WHO? How can Biden reverse Trump's decision?
So all Biden does to reverse Trump's decision is to send a letter informing them that he's no longer withdrawing from WHO. There's an interesting history here, but the US is the only country that is allowed under the WHO Constitution to withdraw. It's just something that the US asked for when the organization was created. And in that moment of goodwill, the other countries said yes. But the process for doing it requires a built-in year-long delay. So Trump informed WHO in July that we would be withdrawing, and it waits a year until that becomes official. And in the meantime, the US has not withdrawn. And so Biden sends a letter saying, just kidding. And that's the end of that. And nothing changes. Regaining influence is a different story. So we can talk more about that if you want. But
yeah, please do. How do you think our influence will be impacted coming out on the other side? I mean, it's going to cost us all of a first-class postage stamp to do so, but what more will the price be?
Maybe he can even tweet it out. I mean, there's been a tremendous loss of face, right? There's been a tremendous loss of status and of the explicit and implicit warrant and guarantee that the U.S. has always given of backing this liberal international order. That's not to say that we always play by the rules. It's not to say that we haven't abandoned different institutions at different points or threatened to. But the WHO, the U.S. has been a mainstay of global health diplomacy. And Trump's willingness to walk away from that creates a trust issue for the future. How do we know that the next administration won't do the same? The US also exercises its influence in WHO in a variety of ways. So part of it is the money that we give, and we are the largest funder. But a lot of it is the really close working relationship that members of the US government have with the Secretariat in Geneva. We have a lot of staff from CDC seconded to WHO. Even more staff throughout the US government that work on these issues work really closely in partnership with their counterparts at WHO to address problems all over the world, to provide technical, expertise and kind of weigh in on policy development and also weigh in with funding. And that kind of, as you will all appreciate, that sort of subsurface collaboration where you're really getting in on the ground floor to shape the white papers that become the discussion in the governing bodies that then become the policies. It's hard to overstate how important that is. And a lot of those relationships have been terminated or have been interrupted and kind of need to be recovered. And then the last piece is the influence that the US exerts through its diplomacy at the World Health Assembly and at the executive board, the coalitions that it's able to build. And again, I think there's a willingness and a welcome, to welcome the US back to the table, a relief that the US is back at the table, and also questions about, trusting that going forward. And maybe also an unwillingness to defer to the US in the way that would have been in the past, because we walked away and we haven't been part of answering hard questions, we signaled our willingness to do so. So sort of regaining that position, a little bit like high school, if you're in one social group and you move away for a year and then you decide to come back, whether you can still sit at the cool kids table is TBD. So.
But you don't see us gaining any leverage by dint of not now walking away?
No, because, we haven't really left, and it's the threat to do so that's damaging. It's the signal that sends about the reliability of the United States that's damaging.
All right.
Okay, I have another, sorry.
No, go ahead, David, go ahead.
I have another question. Are there countries that should belong to WHO that aren't currently a part of it? Is Taiwan, is that an issue with China?
My view or like what the politics are, my view is sure, of course Taiwan should be there. The reason that Taiwan is not there is because the 194 member states, including China, would need to approve it. Taiwan would need to be recognized by the United Nations, which it is not currently. And short of that, there's nothing that the Secretariat can do. So, unless and until China is willing to waive its opposition to Taiwan becoming a member, unfortunately, that is what it is. It's not what it should be, but it is what it is.
And there are no other nations that are not members, is that correct?
There are, so you're testing me here. WHO has 194 members. The UN has 192. I think Cook Islands and one other, maybe Nauru, are members of WHO and not members of the United Nations. And then there are a couple, Luxembourg and that are members of the United Nations and not members of WHO.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question. Australia and China have been in a dispute. Was that because Australia wanted to do its own investigations of the origin of the disease? What's the current status of that situation?
Also testing me. So I will say I'm not totally up to snuff on where that is. But as far as I remember, it's not that Australia wanted to do its own investigation, but it's that Australia was pushing to allow WHO to investigate and to investigate independently. So this, I think they mentioned in the video that, the IAEA, for example, has the authority to send teams into countries without an invitation from member states, and WHO does not. And Australia suggested that they be allowed to, and Australia suggested that the Chinese government has not been forthcoming, is not welcoming the team, and sort of criticized China for that. So I think that was the source of the Chinese government's ire. And I believe that's where it stands. I'm not sure if there have been any more recent developments.
It's ironic that the IAEA has these more intrusive powers, and the area in which the WHO works could be equally life-threatening, if not more so, when dealing with worldwide pandemics, as opposed to perhaps a contained nuclear explosion somewhere. It's just, it seems as though we have some of our priorities out of balance here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of what's in the scope of people's vision and imagination in a way that, you know, the idea of you know, nuclear weapons getting into the wrong hands is a threat that we're all keenly aware of, and certainly during the Cold War was keenly understood of, you know, the dangers of nuclear war. The last pandemic like this was 1918, so people know that it can happen, but it's hard, you know, unless you're in global health and you spend all your time thinking about this, it's hard to grasp the repercussions and the impact on life and the loss of life. You know, that whereas it's, I think, much easier to envision from, you know, a nuclear accident or something. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see if we all certainly know now, and we'll see if that's enough to convince member states that they need to let go of a little bit of that sort of closely guarded sovereignty in order to advance their security. Who knows?
Yeah, the video didn't give us much hope, given the recent studies that it mentioned, and no one could seem to agree upon anything to do anything. It just stays in a state of stasis.
That's, I mean, that's been the history of
that's the UN system, of course, but I mean, writ large, consensus all around.
Everyone wants change, but no one wants to give up what they want, and you know, we get what we have, the organization that we've made. And it has always been this way. You know, I think with respect, what John Bolton said in the video about WHO used to be this lean, mean, disease-fighting machine.
What happened, by the way, they mentioned in particular in the 70s and 80s about the need to refocus, or that it fell down during the HIV pandemic?
So a couple of things happened. Yeah, so a couple of things happened there. One was, you know, they mentioned that the number of member states ballooned with decolonization, right? So if corralling 48 members is hard, corralling 194 members is harder. WHO works on very strong norms of consensus at the World Health Assembly. So, you know, things can be put to a vote, and rarely things are, but it's extremely rare. It's usually like Taiwan and Palestine issues. Otherwise, everything is decided by consensus, and if there's no consensus, it's pushed off to next year. So that's hard. One of the other things that happened in the 70s was, well, smallpox was going on, and that was successful. But WHO had tried other eradication campaigns, malaria, earlier on, even I think in the 50s and 60s, that failed horribly. And that wound up costing a lot of money and set back efforts to fight malaria in Africa, and kind of made the organization a little bit gun shy about the scope of the projects that it took on. And it moved into a more sort of advisory or technical role, especially for lower middle income countries that really needed that. Then as the number of member states ballooned, so did their priorities. So the reason that WHO focuses on so many issues, with what Brett Schaefer was talking about, you know, things that maybe you would think are better left to national governments, is because member states mandate it to. They ask at the World Health Assembly, they pass a resolution saying WHO needs to do more work on this or that, and everybody wants their priorities addressed. So the organization's mandate kind of ballooned, the number of issues that it covers ballooned. And then really poor leadership under a director general named Nakajima in the 80s tremendously damaged the organization. And I think that sort of laid the groundwork for the failure on HIV. And it was the organization just didn't respond aggressively enough, and didn't lead on the science, and didn't kind of get its act together. The other piece of that, though, is that HIV became an issue that was much broader than health. So partially because the money that was getting poured into it, but also partially because we understood the security repercussions, or we thought at the time, the development repercussions. It really became a whole of society issue. And so if you look at UNAIDS, which is the UN agency that was created to kind of take this role from WHO, it's a joint UN agency. It brings together UNDP and WHO and lots of other UN agencies, the world, to partner on this issue. And that was reflecting just the broader expertise that was needed, the fact that the funding was coming not from WHO, but from the World Bank, and kind of bringing together a broader coalition that you needed to address the issue, which couldn't have been done within WHO because it's not, it is a medical organization, it's a health organization, but it's not a whole of society organization.
You mentioned Director General. Do you think the WHO would benefit from another former Norwegian Prime Minister like Gro Harlem Brundtland?
I mean, what Brundtland managed to do with that organization was unparalleled. Is absolutely needed. I'm not sure anyone else would have managed to do the same. For what it's worth, she only served one term, in part because doing it the way she did it was so stressful that it became a threat to her health a little bit. Yes, I mean, certainly it needs, any organization, I think, needs a leader like Brundtland. But that said, I don't think Tedros has been doing a bad job. I think he's been making the best of a very, very difficult situation with not a lot of room to maneuver, which isn't to say that he hasn't made mistakes. He totally has. But anyone would, this is not a walk in the park, and there's no trial run for this, and there's no script for it. On the whole, I think he's done a good job, and I think he's been very willing to recognize, internally, if not sort of always, much recognition publicly and even more recognition internally that mistakes were made, and to recognize and admit what those were, and to adapt and learn from them, and be receptive to critical feedback and to suggestions for reform. And we'll see what comes from that. But I think he's the very last person on the planet that would say that WHO has done everything right and nothing need change in the future.
I was just trying to ask, when does his term end, and who is likely to succeed him? It goes to another geographic area of the world, I imagine.
So he can, it's elected. So there's no, built-in rotation system. He can run again at the end of his term, and we'll see if he will.
And these are 5-year terms.
5-year term.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, David, go ahead.
We have another question from a participant. In light of the broad health mandate of WHO, do you see it playing a role in addressing climate change and its attendant health impacts?
I mean, the health impacts part, certainly. And climate change, I think they're trying. I think they're trying to center a conversation around the impact of climate change on health, and what, both what the challenges that climate change will create and that need to be addressed. And also, everything from sort of migration to the fact that we can expect to see more emerging diseases, and maybe more emerging diseases with pandemic potential. So there was 100 years between the last pandemic and this one, and that might not be the case before the next one. So I think there's certainly a keen awareness of climate change as a towering threat, and they're engaging in all the ways that they can. But like HIV, in a way, this is another issue that is really a whole of society issue. So, it's not easy for WHO to carve out what is the health piece of that and somehow kind of address that. And then, there's even more questions about the limits of our imagination, our ability to envision threats and to respond proactively before we're, knee deep in the midst of them. And even more so for climate change than for a pandemic. And we didn't do it too well with the pandemic, so.
More frequent pandemics on the horizon. That's a cheery thought, I must say.
Possibly, hopefully not. But
Okay. David?
Okay. Participant wanted to ask, do you happen to know how much vaccine denial or hesitancy is in the world? Is it similar to the US?
That's a really good question. I think it's hard to answer because we don't have, there have been some studies on this I'm sure you could find. It's hard, kind of a hard thing to get data on. I think what we've seen in the US is vaccine hesitancy across the board. which I think, for all vaccines, even before COVID, that this is dangerous. Vaccines are dangerous and they cause autism and all of that stuff. My sense, and I should say, like, this is not my area of expertise, so please do check me on this. My sense is that tends to be lower around the world than it is in the US and some European countries, just because we're pioneering that. But I think there is more specific hesitancy around the COVID vaccine in general, because it's new and it was developed quickly. And, there's a fear that this is sort of drug companies trying to make money off of people, and whatever else. So I expect that there will be more hesitancy around the COVID vaccine than there are maybe around, standard childhood immunization. But we'll see what happens.
Okay, did anyone else? Mike?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Dr. Pillinger, in your article, you noted there was a pathological fragmentation, as you called it, that has resulted from the WHO's highly decentralized operations. How should this be addressed to assure greater efficiency and effectiveness?
That's a good question. It's a strength for the organization and a weakness. So WHO is unique in that, and I'll talk about the fragmentation within the organization first, but in that it has these 6 regional offices that are immensely powerful, and they all have country offices, and they have their own regional health assemblies, and they have their own budgets, and they appoint their own directors. And there's just a lot of independence from Geneva. Tellingly, this is the regional office for the Americas is PAHO. WHO calls it AMRO, the American Regional Office, and PAHO, which predated WHO, insists on calling itself PAHO. So like the fact that symbolically they don't even agree on what the name of this organization is like a little bit telling, right? I mean, colloquially, we all call it PAHO, but anyway. So, the independence of these regional offices can be a strength because it allows them to be more responsive to the needs of member state governments. And where you have, especially lower and middle income countries that are relying on WHO for technical advice and stuff, the ability to work quite closely with them in country and at the regional level and respond to their priorities is a strength. But the disconnect from Geneva is a real weakness because there's no command and control with Ebola, and some of this has been fixed with the health emergencies program, but there's a problem with the flow of information between levels of the organization. There's a problem coordinating action between levels of the organization. And it's just really hard to have an efficient global response when, the head in Geneva is disconnected from the limbs in the regions. And I think, so the answer is to figure out how you strengthen that relationship and that accountability. And the health emergencies program, when they created this after Ebola, in response to what the flaws with that response were, they created centralized lines of authority between the country, the regional offices in Geneva, which sort of don't exist, but they like drilled a line through the center of the org chart and said, no, there's going to be one line of reporting here, one line of accountability. And that has worked actually. So, proof that when they choose to reform WHO, they can do it and it works. It's just whether or not they choose to. There's another set of issues around fragmentation with the other actors in global health. That's sort of a different question, and I can talk more about if you want, but I'll stop now.
It brings to mind our good friend Ambassador Bolton's criticism some years ago about they could lop 10 floors off the 39-story Secretariat in New York and they would never be missed. Speaking to the fragmentation again,
I mean, that's true. Sorry, that's true, but that's a cheap shot, right? Criticizing bureaucracy for being large and inefficient is true and is also not the point and not the problem, right? So it becomes a convenient scapegoat for the things that member states don't want to do and don't want to admit that they don't want to do. And sure, we should have less bureaucracy in the world, but
is there anything in particular in WHO though that you would shed or restructure or reorganize to perhaps make it more efficient?
That's a good question. They have reorganized internally a lot of times in response to sort of shifting priorities and shifting ways to think about sets of health issues. At this point in time, I think this is a little bit musical chairs, right? The problems, the limitations that the organization face aren't coming out of the Secretariat. At different points in time, they were, right? They've been addressed through internal reforms. So that's not the set of problems that we're dealing with now. And I don't think that moving around the boxes on the org chart in Geneva is going to solve the problems of member states not wanting to finance the organization and not wanting to cooperate with it necessarily.
David?
Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm not seeing any at the moment, but we can wait a few more seconds.
While we're waiting, perhaps I could ask Dr. Pillinger, we've heard a lot about the COVAX regime. How exactly does that pooled procurement mechanism work? Is the U.S. a member, and what are the costs and benefits and all that?
Sure. This is a doozy, and this is kind of the hot issue and a big problem right now. So COVAX is a mechanism that was set up to ensure that low and middle income countries would be able to access vaccines, because what happened in 2009 with H1N1, which we call a pandemic, but was not like on this scale, right? Is that the rich countries bought up all the vaccines and poor countries got sent to the back of the line. And to prevent that from happening again, they created this COVAX mechanism, which is partially a pooled procurement mechanism and partially about helping countries to kind of strengthen their capacities to distribute vaccines. And the idea here was that early on, when we didn't know which vaccine would work, this was a way for all countries to reduce their risk by buying into COVAX, and COVAX would then create contracts with all of the manufacturers. And this way countries didn't have to sort of play the odds in terms of picking which vaccines to pre-order and hoping that you picked the right one. But high-income countries went ahead and did massive pre-orders anyway. And the idea behind COVAX is that it would also distribute the vaccine equitably. So the first vaccine that was received would go to all countries evenly to vaccinate 20% of the population everywhere, the most at-risk people everywhere. And then the rules on sort of how the rest of the vaccine that it procured would be divided up, were dependent on sort of the epidemic and other things in different countries. And high-income countries wound up contributing money to COVAX, which helps finance the purchase of vaccines for low and middle income countries. And supposedly they're supposed to be getting doses through COVAX because they kind of bought into the pool. We'll see if they actually wind up taking those. But at the same time, they went ahead, they negotiated their own pre-orders, and they're getting those first. And so they're no longer, we're no longer having the vaccine go to the centralized point, or it would never have been like the vaccine go to a centralized point and get distributed equitably. The high-income countries are first in line, they're getting their vaccine, and the timing of when COVAX will actually get the vaccine to distribute is kind of up in the air, partially because the first vaccines to come, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, COVAX didn't have contracts with, and that's because the storage requirements for these vaccines are hard for most countries in the world to manage. The vaccines that it has contracts for are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and some of the others. And those haven't, well, Oxford came out, but the others haven't come out yet. And they're supposed to be getting the vaccine from a manufacturer called the Serum Institute of India, it's a huge producer, but like tons of places in the world are relying on SII to churn out their vaccines. So there's a long line and there's some jockeying for position. And a couple weeks ago, the Indian government announced that they weren't going to allow the export of vaccines from their countries until a certain percentage of Indians had been vaccinated, which would have, completely screwed COVAX over because that's their supply. And then they walked that back and they said, no, yes, we will allow the export, but the timeline on which they're going to get these vaccines and be able to distribute them is still uncertain. So it's left Global South countries in the lurch. So now they're trying to negotiate their own side deals for access. So the African Union just announced that they negotiated a few 100 million doses. But those are also supposed to be coming from the Serum Institute of India. So you can get in line twice, but like if you're at the back of the line, I'm not sure how that helps actually, that, it's more doses than they would be getting through COVAX, but not any faster. And COVAX will procure more as time goes on, so the math and where the vaccine is coming from is kind of complicated and unclear to everyone. And I think COVAX was big picture kind of, they had to set something up and they had to do it ad hoc, and this is what they came up with, and it is immensely challenging and it hasn't worked very well. And I'm not sure we could have done better given the constraints, which are high-income countries pre-ordering and countries' refusal to loosen intellectual property rights to allow the manufacture of more vaccines. So, yeah,
is it starting to boil down to every country for itself, or what?
A little bit. Not as much as in the past, actually. The other piece of this, and I'm sorry to go on and on, but everyone thought that the next pandemic was going to be a flu virus, right? Because that's what it was in 1918. That's what we were all prepared for. It turns out that it was a coronavirus that acts a whole lot transmits like a flu virus. Mm-hmm. But there are mechanisms that exist that were put in place to deal with a flu pandemic specifically. So there is an international framework for sample sharing, virus sharing, vaccine sharing. So sharing the information that we need to develop the vaccine. And then in return for that, drug companies the vaccine manufacturers had to donate a certain percentage of their vaccines to WHO to be distributed. But that treaty that governs that only applies to flu. So COVAX was trying to set up something for coronavirus that would do it similarly on the fly, but without the legal framework in place. High-income countries were always going to pre-order. They just were. And arguably they have an obligation to, right? Arguably a government's, first obligation is to safeguard the health of its people. Where the response has failed is that we have let it become a race between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. Instead of trying to manufacture more, we've said there's going to be a limited amount. Now go duke it out for who gets enough. And that's just the wrong approach, right? We should be focusing on producing more vaccine and not expecting, high-income countries not to pre-order, many times what they needed. And they pre-ordered many times what they needed because they didn't know which vaccine will work. And they will donate the rest, but they're not going to donate the rest until, time TBD when, they know that they have enough for their populations. A lot of those vaccines are the ones that haven't been approved yet. The terms under which they're going to contribute to them, we don't donate the vaccines, we don't know. So we don't know whether they'll give their access to COVAX for distribution or whether it's going to be kind of clientelism. And, China's going to ship to countries where it's trying to increase influence, in the US and Canada, and, we'll send their access to countries where they're trying to increase influence. So we'll see what happens. But it didn't have to be this way. The massive pre-orders by high-income countries were unavoidable, but it's a dodge to focus on that is the reason why we don't have access in lower and middle-income countries. I think others would disagree.
If we
meanwhile, I was going to say, meanwhile, in our own nation, we have 330 million people. We're struggling to vaccinate 20 million at the current time. We haven't even obtained that figure yet. And I hear different estimates in order to get to where we need to be vaccinating 1.5 million to 3.5 million people a day. I think Dr. Lena Wen quoted that last figure. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, we really seem to need a massive increase in daily administration of vaccine here, don't we?
We do, and we do even more so with the advent of these more transmissible variants. So the variant that was detected in the UK and possibly the one detected in South Africa they're far more transmissible. They spread much more effectively and more rapidly than the COVID that we're all living with now does. The SARS-CoV-2. And so that's scary. So we are in a race to vaccinate enough people before this variant really takes over. And we're not winning right now. There are problems all along the line in terms of supply, but also the way that that supply is being farmed out to states, the information that's being shared with states, the predictability of supply, manufacturing issues. There have been setbacks in how many doses were manufactured, how they're distributed at the state and local level, the systems in place for people to sign up. Every single part of this is massively problematic. We had a year to plan for it, and we did not. And you know, the Biden administration incoming is focusing a ton of attention on this. We heard some last night, we'll hear more today. A big piece of it is funding that the states need to be able to, you know, implement their programs. So hopefully help is coming, and better policy, better guidance from states is coming, because states, you know, the Trump administration from day one has put the federal government in a backseat, put CDC in a backseat, and told states to figure it out for themselves. And states are not equipped to do that, in part because the federal government has always done it, right? Like, state health departments shouldn't be coming up with 50 sets of guidelines. They should be getting guidelines from CDC and following them. And that's what they are prepared to do. That's the way it's always worked. So, you know, it's no wonder that states are kind of struggling in the absence of federal funding and federal guidance. You know, it turns out to stop a pandemic, we need a federal government. We're running out of time.
Good point. Good point. David, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Regarding the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, you mentioned it briefly, the testing issues that can make it slower to get approved here than elsewhere. Could you elaborate in lay terms?
Sure. So there are clinical trials, which is the process that vaccines go through to get approved are called clinical trials. And there are 3 levels. And they test first if it's safe, and then if it's effective in small groups, and then if it's effective in large groups. And those trials are underway in different parts of the world. So, and one of the trials is going on in the US. And in the piece of the trial that happened in Britain, there was like a mess up in protocol. So it turns out that a group of people got a different amount of vaccine than another group of people. And it looked like the vaccine was more effective in the group that got 1.5 doses as opposed to 2 doses, which, for complicated reasons I won't go into, might be true. And it also might be an artifact of the group of people that got that dose and the timing between when they got their doses. So the UK went ahead, like, it seems like worst case scenario, the vaccine is somewhere over 60% effective, which to me is good, right? Like, if you had told me a year ago that in a year we were gonna have a 60% effective vaccine, I would have popped the champagne. But, you know, when compared to the other vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, it looks less effective. We can talk about, I don't think we should look at it that way, but we can talk about that. So the idea is that the US wants to wait and see the result of the data of the trial that was conducted in the US before we make a decision about approving the vaccine in the US. I think I am sure that it will be approved. It's just, you know, we want to know what it is we're approving and how well how well we expect it to work, and maybe that guides some decisions about the timing of administering doses, or who, you know, which groups of people get different vaccines. But we just kind of want to have all the information before we approve it, which is good, which is exactly what we want to happen, right? Like, we want transparency, and we want all the information, and we want to make a decision that's not influenced by political pressure. So, did that answer the question? Whoever had it? Okay.
Well, we don't have any rebuttal, so I imagine it did. David, anything else?
Yes, we have another one. If we didn't already have the WHO in the world, is there an organization or something you would argue should be created? Or if you had a blank slate, would you argue for something different?
I mean, what's the old adage about the UN? If you didn't have one, you'd have to create one. It's true. And it's a universal membership organization. So if you want to have a universal membership organization, it means if you are going to recreate an organization, it would have all the same members. And assuming that those members had all the same interests, we would wind up with the same kind of organization that we have now. It doesn't matter what it's called. You can move it to a different building, but if member states aren't willing to finance it, they're not willing to give up sovereignty, and they just want to give it a huge mandate, then we're going to wind up with the same thing. There's no way to have a global organization with the same global players that, that winds up being different. We get the organization that we design, we get the organization that we pay for. And, the analogy that I use to think about WHO is like, the old Hulk comics, right? You have like mild-mannered scientist Bruce Banner like going around with his briefcase that suddenly, as needed, is able to transform into the Incredible Hulk. And like WHO is not, right? WHO is an organization of mild-mannered scientists, and then a pandemic hits, and then there's still an organization of mild-mannered scientists. They don't magically transform into Hulk just because we need it to. So, governments are going to have to decide what they want, and they'll get that. I don't know how else to say it.
Sort of a question of human and national nature. They just want.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Things.
Yeah. Yeah.
In your article, and I think we should. I'm mindful of the fact that President-elect Biden is going to be making a speech in about another 15 minutes on his COVID plans. So. And I know you'd like to see that. No, I think.
I mean, I can stay till the end and just watch it later, but I didn't know.
No, but I think we all would. In your article, could you expand upon the statement that was made that, quote, trade and travel restrictions are usually imposed in such a way that they are ineffective at actually containing the spread of the disease, but are economically damaging and can interfere with the public health responses? What are some examples of that in our current crisis? How would you overcome that?
So the trick is, if you can really seal your borders, trade and travel restrictions will work, right? The virus moves in people. If people aren't moving, the virus isn't moving. The way that and that's what New Zealand has done, by the way, right? And it's working. That is so hard to do in an interconnected world. It is so hard to do if you are not an island that has to be accessed by air. The way that we implement trade and travel restrictions in practice are piecemeal, are depending on which airport you're coming from, are too late because we don't implement them until we see that we have a problem in a given country. And if the virus is already there, then it's like a wildfire. If you can prevent the first few sparks, you're okay. But once you have the wildfire going, adding a few more sparks isn't the difference. So by the time we know we need them, it's probably too late, especially for a country like the US, where there's so many people coming in and out all the time. There's a downside to them, which is that it makes, and also I should say, like trade and travel restrictions, which ones you implement kind of depends on the virus. But for anything other than like basically an airborne virus, like, that's highly contagious, like, SARS or COVID or flu or whatever. Trade and travel restrictions are kind of less of an issue because you're not worried that you're going to get a bloodborne disease standing next to somebody in an airport line, or, diseases that are harder to transmit. We just kind of have different strategies for approaching them. So, for something like Ebola, this is not, this is banning flights from Africa is not going to help. The issue, the downsides though, is that governments that are afraid of getting slapped with trade and travel restrictions, which are immensely economically damaging, are going to be reluctant to report cases of a virus early, because they're going to be afraid that if they admit that they have an outbreak, every country in the world is going to say, oh my God, I have to stop, seal my borders so that the disease doesn't come here. And that the economic damage that does makes it harder for countries to fight outbreaks. First of all, it makes it harder to get in the supplies that you need and the people that you need and all of that kind of stuff. And it also really disincentivizes countries from reporting. And that we don't want, because we just saw what happens with that in China, right? Then by the time, they do admit that they have a problem, it's too late. So it's not that these are bad tools, it's just that they have a lot of downsides, and it's really hard to use them in a way that you benefit from the upsides. And therefore, most often the calculation kind of doesn't work. If you're willing to do what New Zealand did and seal your borders and wait it out, and you can do that as a country, then it's a different story. But
Thank you. David?
Do we have any information on how well the Chinese and Russian vaccines are doing?
We do. I talked a little bit about the Chinese vaccines before. It's kind of spotty. The Russian vaccine also. I think, as far as I know, so they said that it was like as effective as the mRNA vaccines, right? They said that it was upwards of 90% effective. But as far as I know, they have not fully released and published the data. And it was a really small group of people that they did the trial in, which is, when you're playing with percentages, the denominator is everything, right? So I don't have any reason to believe a priori that it's not as effective as they say, except the innate skepticism of like, if you have the goods, show us the data. If you haven't released your data, then there's probably a reason why. But that's speculation. And I know that they're actually currently in talks with AstraZeneca to do a new clinical trial where you combine one dose of the Russian vaccine and one dose of the Oxford vaccine. I can explain why they would do that. But I think if AstraZeneca is willing to play ball with them, then that maybe gives a little bit more credence to the data, which I assume they have seen. But I think transparency in this data is really critical right now. That's how we have trust in the vaccines or not.
Please talk about the suggestion of giving only one of two required shots to vaccinate more people.
This is so complicated. So here's the thing. All the vaccines except the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the trial was for 2 doses. We should absolutely not give fewer than 2. We should not decide that we can use this as a single dose vaccine and have it be effective in the same way. We don't have any evidence that it will be, and we don't want to make a guess. Giving a vaccine that is less than effective or whose efficacy is short-lived is really dangerous because you will encourage evolution of the virus to be resistant to the vaccine. So we don't want to mess with the vaccine efficacy. That said, there have been a number of proposals floated for like 2 issues. Can we extend the time before which we give the second dose? And do you have to hold the second dose in reserve once you give someone a first dose? Or can we just give the vaccine as it comes in and trust that the supply will be able to keep up so that when it's time for people to have their second doses, there will be second doses there? Those are, I think, playing around with the time frame that the vaccine is administered in is likewise dicey, and the drug companies have kind of come out really strongly against that and just said, we don't have the data, we can't say that it's effective, don't do it. That said, there's some evidence with the AstraZeneca vaccine that a longer interval might actually be better. So again, this is what kind of came out of the weird mess up in the trial. So, I think that's something that has to be decided by the regulatory agencies on a case-by-case basis based on the data from the vaccine. Do you give the doses as you get them and trust that there will be enough to give a second dose in time question is a logistics piece. And, I don't have kind of an inside view of how confident they are. The drug companies are saying, yes, do it. We promise that the supply will be there, but I can't speak to whether that's how much confidence we can have in that. And that's really the question on which all of this hangs. But there's tremendous pressure to vaccinate as many people with at least one dose as quickly as possible because we're trying to race against the spread of this new variant. And one dose will be effective at least until you can get the second dose, right? At least for a short period of time, it's better than nothing. So those are sort of the factors that are getting weighed in. Some countries have suggested just using one dose, even if it's a 2-dose vaccine, and I think that's utterly crazy, and the US has said that it's not going to do that. So.
That's reassuring. David?
Okay. As of currently, I don't see any additional questions. Did any other participants have any last-minute questions?
Speak now or forever hold your peace. Well, if no one is speaking, I think it's high time that I take the opportunity once again to thank Dr. Pillinger
Thank you guys. It was my
very,
pleasure.
very greatly. And we're most appreciative of you giving so much of your time today. You've been a brilliant speaker, very informative, and it's just been an overall very enjoyable afternoon. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We're indebted.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Yes, thank you.
All the best. Keep well.
You too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.